papyrus was the stationery of the ancient world. It was manufactured from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grew predominantly in the Nile Delta in Egypt, as well as in the remainder of the Nile Valley. Occurrence of the papyrus plant in antiquity is also attested for such areas as Palestine, Babylonia and Sicily. But only in Egypt was papyrus processed into a material for writing. From there, papyrus rolls were exported and used all over the Mediterranean world. The material is understandably extremely sensitive to dampness. Because of that, the initial papyrus finds were limited to the desert areas of Egypt, with the exception of the city of Herculaneum, where carbonized papyri have been excavated. More recently, papyri have also been found at various places outside of Egypt, Derveni in Greece, Petra in Jordan, at sites in Syria and in Palestine. These papyri are stored in the museums and papyrus collections of the world, the largest of which is the Papyrus Collection in Vienna, essentially concerning the beginnings of papyrology.
In 1878, some Egyptian fellahs were searching for fertilizer. This is the story that we've been told for generations. And in an ancient city, the city of Arsinoe, they found a rubbish dump, and in that heap they found a great deal of written material. That material reached the antique dealers in Cairo. At the end of the 19th century, an Austrian, whose name was Theodor Graf, was working there already. For several years he had been trading in Oriental antiques of every possible variety, and evidently was one of the very first to see this material on the market. With the talent of a good businessman, he correctly assessed it as valuable, acquired it and brought it to Vienna.
Having arrived in Vienna, Theodor Graf contacted his friend Josef von Karabachek, a professor of Oriental languages who was able to decipher and classify old documents in Arabic script. A young high school teacher and classical language student, Karl Vesely, was able to decipher the Greek. These two were joined by the young Egyptologist Jakob Krall. Already by 1883, an exhibition was organized in Vienna to find a buyer for the items which were still the property of Theodor Graf. Despite the large amount of attention which the unique documents generated, long and laborious negotiations were necessary until at last Archduke Rainer bought the first lot of more than 10,000 items with his privy purse.
Wenn wir die Zahl nennen von 10.000 Stück und mehr, dann beginnen dem heutigen die Augen nicht mehr zu rotieren.
If we cite a number of 10,000 items and more, today people no longer roll their eyes but let them drop, as 10,000 items is now out of question. 1883 is therefore the serious establishing date of the Archduke Rainer Papyrus Collection, as it is called today. The Archduke commissioned Theodor Graf to transact further purchases in Egypt. Until 1899, this fruitful cooperation functioned very well. In 1899, the Archduke gave the entire collection to the Emperor on occasion of his birthday. And since that date, the Papyrus Collection has been part of the Austrian National Library, a special collection like the many other collections of the Great Library.
Nationalbibliothek, eine Spezialsammlung wie die vielen anderen Sammlungen der großen Bibliothek.
Currently, with its 180,000 items, the Viennese papyrus collection is the largest in the world. There are 60,000 Greek papyri, 22,000 Coptic, and altogether 80,000 Arabic documents. The remainder consists of documents of hieroglyphics, hieratic, Demotic, Latin, Hebrew, Syrian, and Pahlavi. With such quantity, it is understandable that the larger percentage of these is still awaiting deciphering and classification.
Aber das ist ein Fetzen aus einem Tomos Synchronismus. Hier geht die Klebung, ein Dokument, ein zweites Dokument. Das sind also keine Privatnotizen. Das könnte ein Kaufvertrag sein.
To say something about the content of a papyrus, you need someone who is capable of reading and deciphering the document. One must be familiar with Egyptian languages and writing, or with Greek or Arabic.
Die Sammlung hat diesbezüglich auch ihr Schicksal erlebt.
In this regard, the collection has experienced its own fate. At the beginning, there were 3 scholars, Karabacek, Vesely and Krall. Over the course of its history, there were fewer, even up to the closing of the collection during the era of the Nazis, who considered the papyrus collection with its holdings to be uninteresting scrawlings. Today, the situation is essentially better. There are 2 Gracists, a Coptologist, an art historian and archaeologist, as well as an academically trained restorer. But not only the in-house personnel are examiners of our holdings, moreover students from the University of Salzburg, from the University of Vienna, and scholars from all over the world.
Rund die Welt.
Let us return to the 8th decade of the 19th century. Shortly after the papyrus acquisition via Theodor Graf, European scholars and learned societies began the first systematic papyrus excavations. The most successful were those by Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Surridge Hunt, who made rich finds first of all in the Fayum, and then in El Benassa, the ancient Oxyrhynchos.
Now, Grenfell was a postgraduate student in Oxford at the Queen's College, as was his colleague Hunt. And the Egypt Exploration Society asked them to go to Oxyrhynchus and to the Fayum to look for papyri. The reason they chose Oxyrhynchus was because it is known that Oxyrhynchus in the Christian period, from the 3rd to the 6th century, was the seat of a bishop. And that the Historia Monachorum, a history of the 4th century AD, tells us that there were many churches in that town and monasteries outside. Because of this, they thought they might find papyri in the rubbish dumps of the town. And they were spectacularly successful.
The first volume of the Oxyrhynchos papyri, published in 1898, contains papyri of the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas and of many biblical texts. But not only biblical texts, but also private documents and testimonies to Greek literature. Texts of Homer, Plato, Thucydides, Sappho, Sophocles, Demosthenes. Texts of many of the great authors of classical antiquity were found in manuscripts about 1,000 years older than those which had emerged from European libraries. The doyen of German papyrology, Ulrich Wilken, was not as fortunate as Grenfell and Hunt. In 1899, he excavated in Heracleopolis. The finds were destroyed, however, in a ship fire in Hamburg. In most cases, the discovery of papyri is only a prelude to the difficult tasks of restoring and preserving. The steps in preservation of a papyrus are adapted to the total condition of the particular specimen. If, as in most cases, the acidity is high and the condition of the papyrus allows for aqueous treatment, this method is surely the most effective for flushing out the accumulated acid and decomposed cellulose chains. The decomposition of cellulose and hemicellulose chains weakens the binding characteristics of the fibers and contributes to the decay of the papyrus leaf. The proportion of lignin in the material is responsible for the browning of the leaf, which originally was light yellow. This discoloration, which may considerably affect legibility, needs to be counteracted through appropriate conservative measures. The composition and condition of the ink is also very significant for the process. What originally began as an unsightly wad of papyrus, under the skillful hand and practiced eye of the restorer, step by step, gradually assumes once again the form of a sheet. A more difficult and exacting task, however, is also involved. The papyrus fibers must be unfolded, smoothed, and placed into position, all taking place during the same phase. This exacting work can be carried out only through use of an illuminating magnifying glass and microscope. Since each fiber may display ink traces, this work has to be accomplished with great concentration and attention, for even the smallest trace of ink contributes to the restoration of a letter. After the smoothing and positioning have been completed, the papyrus fragments are dried under moderate pressure between wood and acid-free sheets of blotting paper. The paper is changed repeatedly to absorb and draw off the remaining moisture from the papyrus sheet. The fragments remain in a special press overnight, completing the drying process. On the next day, one can begin to piece together the puzzle.
Da haben wir schon mal Faser, die kennt. Da haben wir Faser. Nein, passt genau her. Und ich...
Nicht da.
Weiß ich nicht, da geht es ja noch weiter. Dass das möglicherweise da so irgendwie
Da dran
herkehrt.
gehört.
Oh, das schaut...
Nicht wirklich überzeugend aus.
Nein.
Ja, dann gibt es nur noch die zweite Möglichkeit, dass es sozusagen von einem anderen Blatt ist.
Ja, das habe ich mir auch gedacht. Dass da mehrere Blätter waren und dass die anderen Fragmente, die man jetzt vielleicht nicht zuordnen kann, da drinnen waren oder außen einfach dran. Ne?
Was natürlich leicht sein kann.
The mosaic resulting from the whole discussion, including the small fibers and fiber bridges, is set with fixative and strips of Japanese paper. The restored papyrus leaf is then placed between glass plates and archived for future study.
From documentary papyri, we can read everything which an Egyptian wrote during the course of his life. From the documents, it is not difficult to reconstruct the life of a hypothetical inhabitant of ancient Egypt. At the beginning of this person's life, we encounter his birth announcement. Such documents were common in Roman times, standing in the service of laography, the population overview gathered for the ruler and used by the finance administration.
A birth announcement also secured a child's eventual rights of inheritance and privileges. If it was not registered, it could not assert any claims.
Le dichiarazioni di nascita dei Greco-Egizi erano indirizzate.
The birth announcements of the Greco-Egyptians were brought by the father or by both parents to the responsible official of the city or village. In the city of Erzherzog, the announcement was issued by the owner of the house in which the child had been born. The announcement contained the age of the child, 2 or more years, sometimes up to 8 years. Possibly due to high infant mortality, an earlier announcement was not at all advisable.
To Diogenes, the scribe of the village of Nilopolis and Soknopaionesos, from Paoetes, the son of Bacchusis. I herewith announce my son Bacchusis, who was born for me by my wife Taoetis. He is 3 years old. Therefore I deliver this message.
And the village scribe Diogenes, we may recognize him through the change in writing, confirms the entry.
On Mechir the 13th, in the 24th year of Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus Augustus,
that is, on February 25th, 184 after Christ. In birth announcements, we read directly the state of affairs through the onomastics. For Egypt was a multinational polity. Besides the original population, we find Greeks, primarily Macedonians, who after some time are more accurately designated Greco-Egyptians. Additionally, Persians, in the wake of the Macedonians, Romans, Jews, Arabs, Libyans, Syrians, and people from Asia Minor, such as Phrygians, Lucians, and Mysians. What can be learned from these can be demonstrated in short order from the following.
In monotonous lists about real estate, we find in the year 124 before Christ a simple village policeman named Maron alias Nexaftis, son of Petosiris. He is called this until 118. From then on, he registers the 10 aurei of land leased to him as a policeman under the name Maron, son of Dionysius, who formerly was Nexaftis, son of Petosiris. He is about to put aside the name his father gave him. Moreover, he has also volunteered his father a Greek name. We follow up his career. As Maron Dionysio Katoikos, he owns more land in 112, and in 101 he is finally called Maron, son of Dionysius, Macedonian of the Katoikoi horsemen, an exceptional case.
Like the birth announcements, the census, today's residency lists, served a similar purpose and was carried out not accidentally every 14 years.
Every government likes to collect taxes, otherwise governments don't work, and the Roman government of Egypt was no exception. But to collect taxes, you have to know what you can tax. In the case of the Romans, it was people, and so they had to know who the people were. Every man between the ages 14 and 60 had to pay an annual tax to the government, and so the Romans set out to know exactly who the men were, who were between the ages of 14 and 60. And so every 14 years, so that nobody would ever escape, they made everybody fill out census declarations.
These census declarations are usually very simple. They say who the people are, who completed it, where they lived, what type of property they lived in, and who was in the household. That's how we learn about who people were in Roman Egypt. The head of the household, if he had a wife, or sometimes the head of the household was a woman who was divorced or widowed or simply living by herself. We discover if there were children, whether there were grandparents, aunts, uncles, slaves, or others taken in as lodgers, and just about anyone else who might happen to be living with them.
And from this, we find out as well where they had scars on their bodies, because this was included to help identify them, and how old they were. From how old they were, we find out a great deal more. How old they were when they got married and had their first children, for example, and how old people lived to be. We learn that the average age of life was not very long. Certainly by our standards, it was pretty bad. At birth, your chances were that you would live to about 23, 24, 25 years of age. But what that meant was that half of the population who were born today would be dead in 5 years. The others didn't do so badly. Most of them lived into their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
We return to the course of the life of our hypothetical Egyptian. The growing child is fortunate and receives an education. On ostraca, discarded papyrus, wax tablets, materials as cheap as possible. We find countless lettering exercises, alphabets written forward and as an effective learning trick written backwards, syllabaries in their dreadful monotony, calligraphic exercises with the names Europa or Pasiphae, and as a curiosity, a dictation.
Die bekannte Geschichte des Vatermörders.
The well-known story of patricide. There was a son, he murdered his father and became afraid. Whether of the laws, whether of God, it depends, and fled into the desert. And in the desert he was chased by a lion, and so he wanted to climb a tree. But on the tree there was a snake, and so he couldn't climb up. And then he came down and was torn to pieces by the lion. We have detected approximately 20 identical texts, and the texts are from about the 5th up to the 8th century. We can therefore see from this example that they always repeated the same theme. When they liked something and it was useful, they kept it up and continued working with it.
Wenn es gut gefallen ist und wenn man es nützen konnte, dann hat man es beibehalten und man hat damit weitergearbeitet.
The story is well known from Aesop. If we compare the two, we see how the teacher simplifies the sentences on the one hand, on the other he applies a broad spectrum of grammar. But if we indeed examine the spelling of the pupils, we gain a direct impression of the difficulties with which every child learning a foreign language has to cope. Only a single word out of the 43 in this text is spelled correctly by everyone, the article ho.
Man kann natürlich weitergehen mit zu reden über Unterrichtssachen.
We could go on talking about instruction matters. There are also many mathematical texts which are quite simple. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 1 is also 2, 1 times 3 is 3, 3 times 1 is also 3, and so on and so forth. Usually up to 6,000, because the most important currency was the talent, and the talent had 6,000 drachmas. The people, they all were very well acquainted with the drachma, so up to 6,000 they learned to count, and then they stopped.
Naturally, the study of literature occupied a central place in ancient pedagogy. Here we have to ask, what do papyri accomplish for the transmission of ancient texts? Peter Parsons speaks of a second Renaissance.
About a century ago, there was the Second Renaissance, in which this quite unexpected source, that is, from the libraries of Hellenic civilization in Egypt, began to become known to us, and that contributed, I reckon, about 3 copies of 3 papyri of a piece of Greek literature every day since then, and we now have, I think, in several different ways, a much better opportunity to understand both the Hellenic world and the actual world of Greek literature. So if I can divide the subject up somewhat, what we have clearly is fragments of ancient books coming from the Greek-speaking settlements in Egypt over a period of about 1,000 years, covering therefore the post-classical period right up to the early Middle Ages. And these illustrate the civilization of the Hellenes in Egypt in a particular way, namely that you can actually see who was reading what work of Greek literature, when, and in which places.
The number 1 school text, of course, was Homer, the great symbol of what it was to be Hellenic, the Bible of the Greeks. But even in remote places, Pindar or Callimachus, 2 very difficult authors, were also read. Above all, the papyri show us that the educated class of Egypt at the time read a very conservative canon of the great classics. The favorite authors were certainly Homer, Plato, and Euripides.
The comic poet Menander has become accessible to us actually through papyri from Egypt. We may also refer to the oldest musical score to Orestes by Euripides, the Archilochos in Cologne, the unquestionable genuine Gallus, Epicham's Odysseus Automolos, the Athenaion Politeia by Aristotle, the Phenomena by Aratus, the Orphic text from Derveni, the oldest manuscript of Xenophon's Hellenica, or from Latin literature, a fragment of Cicero's Third Catilinaria in Latin and Greek. Without question, we should also mention the still unpublished papyrus from the 3rd century BC, which is the only surviving document from the Alexandrian library and contains the initial words of about 200 otherwise totally unknown epigrams.
Today we can therefore read new texts from Greek literature which have not been seen by any European for almost 2,000 years. Let us continue to follow our hypothetical resume. Perhaps the child obtained vocational training. Contracts with apprentices give us an insight into the various professions.
Segatis, daughter of Satabus, granddaughter of Esueris, submits her young slave Xenophis to the weaver Posiris, son of Panephremys, so that she shall learn for a year and 2 months and sometime longer the weaver's craft, beginning with the first of the month Hatir in the present 14th year of Antoninus Caesar the Lord, under the condition that the slave will be boarded by Posiris and provided clothes, and that Posiris will be responsible for all tax matters associated with this craft, and under the condition that she never leave the house of Posiris without his knowledge neither by day nor at night.
Or the young man embarked on a military career. We know applications for recruitment, requests about discharge because of physical injury, wills, a certificate of debt between 2 soldiers. The one borrows money from the other, and from this we learned unit membership, the names of the commanders, the sum of money, the valuables which the soldier carries with him that can be used as security. Additionally, this is the second oldest internally dated Latin text so far. In a papyrus from the 5th century, we already even meet the first Christian military chaplains. If life, however, follows civil paths, we may assume that our young Egyptian got married, sometimes not without first consulting the oracle concerning whether a marriage would be favorable, as is the case with Asclepiades on the 26th of April in the year 6 AD.
To the greatest mighty god Sognopios from Asclepiades, the son of Areus, whether or not it is permitted me to marry Tapetois, the daughter of Mares, and that she will not become the wife of another. Give me a sign, and fulfill for me this written request.
If the gods were well disposed, the marriage contract between bride and groom could be drawn up.
They arrange with each other, Suchamon, son of Maron, grandson of Suchos, approximately 20 years old, without particular marks, and Aphrodite, daughter of Nalos, granddaughter of Nalos, approximately 44 years old, with a particular mark at the left
our good
side.
Such-Amon is not going to marry a woman more than twice his age. The marriage contract is completed with the future mother-in-law, who is responsible for the dowry of her daughter Aphrodite. The numerous wedding contracts further show that the woman retains as her property the goods that she has brought into the marriage for mutual management. If the marriage ends, she takes her property with her again. Accordingly, we read in Such-Amon's contract,
If, however, after an outbreak of a difference between the married couple it should come to a separation, Suchamon should give back the existing dowry to the bride mother Aphrodite, or if she is no longer alive, to her daughter Aphrodites, in fact immediately, if he dismisses his wife. If, however, she separates voluntarily within 30 days.
Papyri distinguish themselves as outstanding source material not simply on economic matters, but concerning nothing less than the legal dimensions of the marriage contracts.
We also find out some odd details that seem to us very strange. For example, that many married couples were also brother and sister, something that's not allowed in any modern society in the West, and that in fact the ancient Romans didn't think much of either. But the Romans decided that it was okay for Egyptians as long as they weren't Roman citizens, and so they just turned a blind eye to the practice, until one day the Romans turned everybody into Roman citizens, and after that it became illegal.
Soon the young husband will have submitted a birth announcement to the Office of Leographia, which runs the population registry, this time as the cause, whereby the circle closes, indeed only in midlife. In the course of his life there is sufficient opportunity to get to know him as tenant, as a tradesman, as an official, and whatever the colorful palette of life can offer. And of course, he was also a taxpayer.
Der einfache Mensch in der Antike war mit einer großen Anzahl von Steuern belastet.
In antiquity, the simple person was burdened with a large number of taxes, and it would not make much sense to enumerate them all in sequence. I believe that a layman would be interested to learn whether one had to pay more tax in Roman Egypt than today or less. But even a papyrologist who has concerned himself intensely lifelong with just the tax system would hardly be able to give a fast and conclusive answer. The reason is that in antiquity, direct taxes were raised in greater percentage, whereas today we are burdened with an immense number of indirect taxations, which influence the price of goods but are not at all recognized by the individual.
Die sich im Preis von Gütern niederschlagen und dem Einzelnen überhaupt nicht mehr bewusst werden.
In Greco-Roman Egypt, everyone who was 14 years of age was burdened with a fixed yearly tax quota, the so-called head tax, which was levied independently of whether a person was rich or poor. The rate of the head tax was therefore set. There were certain fluctuations in the amount which did not conform to one's social condition, but rather these fluctuations were geographical. In some areas of Egypt, people had to pay less, in other areas, more.
Was uns ganz besonders grotesk anmutet, man kann sogar...
And what might appear to us as completely grotesque, certain classes, groups of the population who had received special privileges had to pay less. The affluent, to simplify it, propertied circles paid possibly less than poor people.
Begüterte Kreise zahlten unter Umständen weniger als die armen Leute.
At the end of earthly existence, there is finally the obituary. It was addressed to the office responsible for leographia with the purpose that the deceased person was struck from the tax rolls and his descendants no longer needed to pay taxes for him. A mummy label was fixed to the corpse itself. This could be made of wood, cloth, or also papyrus, and contain the name of the deceased.
Der Name, weil die Prozesse für Mumifikation waren.
With the name, as the process of mummification was like in a supermarket. There were many corpses, and how should a dead person be identified? So the dead needed a label with the name on it, the time of living, and so on. We have a large quantity of such labels, a small corpus. Well, not so small. There are approximately 2,000 or 3,000.
Wir haben ungefähr ein kleiner Korpus, nur so kleine sind ungefähr 2,000, 3,000.
If descendants could afford it, a portrait of the deceased was placed at the top of the mummy.
After this expedition through the past, let us return to the presence of papyrology. What may we expect of papyrologists today and in the future? Will there be spectacular new finds? Texts that enrich our knowledge and move our hearts? And what new problems will confront papyrology?
At the moment, the most significant fact in Egypt itself for excavation is a result of building the Aswan High Dam in 1964. This supplies half of Egypt with electricity, but has also raised the water table in the Nile Valley everywhere from Aswan to Alexandria. This means that the sites of ancient towns and villages, which used to be dry and where papyrus was preserved, are now wet and the soil is damp, and papyri rot in the soil.
Now, undoubtedly, damp papyri can be saved nowadays by the use of freeze-drying, in the same way as you have freeze-dried peas or carrots or other vegetables in your supermarket. But this is not the same condition as earlier in this century. So what are the places where one would still look for dry, unburied, undamaged texts? First of all, the Western oases, like Kaga, and also in the Eastern Desert, where there are at least 30 Roman forts, where no excavation has ever taken place.
Additionally, a large number of papyri already housed in collections of the world are still unpublished. In the Vienna Papyrus Collection alone, there are more than 60,000 texts worthy of publication. Added to this are new discoveries from mummy cartonnage, which was manufactured from papyri.
So just looking around the world of this year, we know that in Milan there are 600 new lines of Greek epigram from papyrus from cartonnage. We have seen at this conference Professor Claver produce the end of a comedy by Caecilius in Latin. For the first time, again, in 2,000 years, we see some Caecilius. Miss Menchi has just produced a papyrus with what is, I think, a summary of a poem of Callimachus that we don't have otherwise. Now it seems to me that the future continues to be bright, and that we can look forward to a whole series of new discoveries which again will form our knowledge.
Allein der Gedanke, eine Urkunde vor sich zu haben, die 2000 Jahre lang niemand gelesen hat.
Just the thought to have a deed before oneself which has not been read by anybody for 2000 years. Furthermore, the thought that these deeds are dealing with genuine, real persons who have written them, who speak about their problems, their tax liabilities, their marriage quarrels or anything else. That is very electrifying. And though the deciphering is naturally laborious and often leads to dead ends, this detective work, this tracking, first of the wording and then of the facts which lie behind it, that is a very exciting matter, which one isn't offered in any other discipline of ancient studies.
Erstmal des Wortlautes und dann des Sachverhaltes, der dahinter steht. Das ist eine sehr spannende Sache, die einem in keinem anderen, ich glaube, das kann man sagen, in keinem anderen Bereich der Altertumswissenschaft geboten wird.
Most of the work that papyrologists do is pretty much the same today as it was 100 years ago. The papyrologist sits down with the text on a table and tries to figure out what the strange shapes on the papyrus mean.
But that is only the beginning of it. And there are a lot of changes taking place in the field as a result of developments both of modern technology and of the archaeological exploration of the Near East, and as well of the general changes in the intellectual climate of the world in which papyrologists work. For example, the coming of the computer has made it possible to find out where a name or a word appears in all of the papyri that have ever been published within a matter of 3 minutes, something that would have taken hours and hours of searching just 10 years ago. And so many questions that nobody would ever have bothered to ask because they just took too much time to answer are now things that you can find out instantly.
Überhaupt denke ich, ist der Einsatz von Computern gerade in dieser Branche der Altertumswissenschaften ganz besonders weit verbreitet.
Altogether, I think the employment of computers has spread especially far, particularly in this branch of ancient studies. Papyrological databases have been constructed and used over the internet for a long time and have become routine. Using the World Wide Web, we are able to look at photos of papyri, for example, from the Duke Library in the USA and check particular readings.
In dem World Wide Web uns auf unserem heimischen Computer ansehen können, auf diese Weise bestimmte Lesungen kontrollieren. Eine Datenbank.
A database which we make available in Heidelberg likewise can be used all over the world for selections. Meanwhile, colleagues are able to request far more than 20,000 single data files from this and use them for their own research. Much else could be mentioned in this context. I think papyrology is certainly trendsetting for large areas of the humanities.
Für große Bereiche der Geisteswissenschaft.
There is material in abundance yet to be analyzed. There are new possibilities and methods of processing, and there are many young people in all parts of the world who want to work as papyrologists and who by now are already doing good work. The main problem is a common one: the finances.
Und ich bin immer sehr traurig, wenn meine Studenten zum Beispiel sagen, sie möchten Papyrologie als Hauptfach betreiben. Und ich muss ihnen dann sagen, I am always very sad when my students tell me they would like to pursue papyrology as major subject, and I have to answer to them that makes little sense. For with regard to positions, the prospects are very, very poor. At least in Germany, papyrology as a subject is represented only at very few universities. There are also few research institutions like museums where papyrologists could be engaged. It is simply a question of posts. Therefore, theoretically, papyrology is a wonderful subject which could increase more and more and which needs many, many colleagues. In practice, however, I have a somewhat pessimistic view of the situation, because unfortunately we have too few positions.
So, sucht euch wieder einen Platz, wieder auf dem Boden gleich.
For papyrology, contact with the public is not solely a question of existence. The Vienna Papyrus Collection is represented ever more frequently through displays and at special events. Most encouraging was the Coptic exhibition in 1995.
40.000 Besucher im Prunksaal der österreichischen Nationalbibliothek.
40,000 people visited the festival hall of the Austrian National Library, of whom probably a large number became familiar with the world of papyri for the first time. That has been a hint for us how important, how fruitful the outreach, the including of the public in the genuine processing of the collection stock can be. Up until now, a favorable and suitable place has been lacking for being able to really invite the public into the collection. But we do hope that at the turn of the millennium, the Papyrus Collection will open its own Papyrus Museum. It may be a favorable jest by the Norns that the entrance will be on the Heldenplatz.
Wir haben eine Responsabilität, wir haben eine Verantwortung.
We have a responsibility in our work. We should make good editions without errors, and we should consider that though we will die, the papyri will perhaps remain there as a testimony for our civilization and for our life. It is true that this is the past, it is life in antiquity, but we do know that sometimes there is not much difference between the situation in ancient times and now.
Das ist Vergangenheit, das ist Leben in der alten Zeit. Aber wir wissen, dass manchmal die Situation ist nicht so different, nicht so Unterschied zwischen alter Zeit und jetzt.